Well, thank you so much, Alice, for that warm introduction. We are so thrilled to be participating today in Convene AHP, a virtual healthcare philanthropy event. I am Paige Bullington, President and General Manager of Blackbaud Healthcare Solutions, and I just am so thrilled to be able to take part in this event under our new normal, and really excited to talk more about grateful patient philanthropy and how we move forward with this unique part of fundraising. And I'm even more excited to be presenting with my very talented co-presenter, Liza Turcott. So Liza, let you introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you, Paige. Hi, everybody. My name is Liza Turcott. I'm a member of the Blackbaud Healthcare Solutions team, and my expertise for the company is in data-driven healthcare and fundraising. So I'm a former healthcare fundraiser myself, an analytics client. So end user side of things before coming to work at Blackbaud, and I've spent the majority of my time on our analytics consulting team, helping our clients use our solutions to improve their fundraising program. So I'm happy to have the chance to talk to all of you today, and Paige, likewise happy to have the chance to speak in collaboration with you.
So the goals of a patient fundraising program, from my perspective, and I think from many of you in the audience, are really sort of multi-faceted. One, it's certainly to find new major gift prospects. It's also to help you focus on existing major donors. It can be to help you cultivate annual and perhaps monthly or sustainer donors. And last, but certainly not least, it helps you communicate with patients about your mission. And one thing that I think is of utmost importance right now is healthcare really has a bright spotlight on it, and it is a wonderful, positive spotlight. People are so appreciative of the healthcare heroes in their community, of which philanthropy plays a huge role. So right now, patient fundraising, patient-centered philanthropy can really be a vehicle through which you can communicate. And so I think if we go back to the title, we sort of say, don't abandon ship. These are some of the reasons why you want to continue with these programs, albeit with perhaps a slight pivot in some areas. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Liza to talk a little bit deeper about best practices.
Yeah, thank you. That was really helpful framework to talk about how to move beyond some of these challenges. There are certainly added complexities right now, and some things like Paige mentioned that are likely going to shift more permanently moving forward. So as we talk about what that new normal is going to look like, we're going to rely on best practices. So some fundraising best practices in general and best practices for grateful patient fundraising. And we're going to put some twists alongside those best practices along the way. And our goals to help you think in a really robust and strategic way about the potential and possibility of a grateful patient program with your organization. So there are probably some of you on the line today that grateful patient work hasn't, or grateful family work for that matter, hasn't been part of the focus for your organization. So let's do just a couple quick level setting things, and we'll jump into content after that. So in its simplest form, grateful patient, grateful family work is a series of steps, right? What appears on the screen now. The patient database is, of course, the point of origination for the prospects and the donors with whom we're working, but really it's your good development work. The segmentations, outreach, identification, qualification that help your patients identify and see the potential of also being donors, right, in addition to being consumers on the patient side of things. So we're going to walk through each of the steps on the screen here in more detail in our time together today. And we certainly appreciate that there are nuances for every organization, right? The history with which you have with grateful patient fundraising or philanthropy in general matters, how your programs are resourced, that matters, what types of outreach are part of your existing programs, all of that matters too. So our goal today is not necessarily to just sort of stamp out or provide you some kind of cookie cutter methodology for what the future holds, but again, to take a really robust kind of comprehensive look at the potential and possibility with this type of fundraising with some new ideas sort of at the core of that. So I'm going to offer just sort of three other quick things in the interest of good communication before we move on. And we'll talk a little bit more about wealth screening in just a minute, but I'll offer that the frequency of processing files is something that our clients think a lot about, and everybody that has a grateful patient, grateful family program considers. And the deciding factors, if you're going to consider working with patients daily, weekly, monthly on an ad hoc basis, is really the frequency with which you want to engage with your patients and consider outreach, and then of course your volume of prospects. And second thing in mind, with volume in mind, and Paige mentioned this just a minute ago, is thinking about what patient and good prospect could mean right now, because the way in which our patients are receiving care has really been fairly different in a lot of cases in the past several weeks, couple of months, than it was even at the beginning of the year. So for those of you with existing programs, if you've been focused on inpatients, it's a great time to think about outpatients and people that have engaged on the clinical side via telemedicine. And certainly for those of you that are just getting started or thinking, really anew about grateful patient, grateful family work, something that should be top of mind for you as well. And, with the potential to think in sort of new and different ways about your programs and who your prospects are, it's a great opportunity to check in with your legal and your compliance and your IT teams if you're going to make any shifts and changes to the way in which your program is structured and the patients that are going to be part of outreach. Want to make sure, of course, everything remains HIPAA compliant, but is also in line with what your own organization standards and guidelines are as well. So good practice to check in about that first. And under typical circumstances, it's the number of patients that are coming through your doors every day. It's really substantial, especially when you consider it through a lens of prospecting, right? The volumes are really different compared to anything else that happens in the healthcare space. Volumes might be down right now, although, some communities are starting to open up a little bit more. But the volumes aside, it's going to be important to work with your best potential prospects within that population. And importantly, and this is something you'll hear me talk about a lot today, to ensure the way in which you're putting your program together and the way in which you're surfacing patient prospects is really manageable for your staff and for your team. And the easiest way to do that continues to be with a wealth screening tool. It does the heavy lifting of identifying those best prospects through a couple of different avenues, lenses, and it can either be through capacity or through philanthropic habits, or both, right? Tendencies in both areas can be really important. But wealth screenings, they leverage really basic information about prospects, and they compare that, name and address most often when I say basic information, and compare that to best practice prospect research resources available in the public space. And the idea is that you work with a nice, concise set of scores, as you start to consider the volume of patient prospects you have and winnow that down to a group that is manageable and workable for your teams, and prioritize those prospects for different types of outreach. So basically, the goal is to start to generate segmentations within your patient population and provide the ability to focus, saves time and money, and everybody's happy about that, right? So there are lots of, again, potential avenues through which you could build a grateful patient program, but we're going to stick to 3 primary segmentations that we see most often when we work with our healthcare clients, and that's what's on the left-hand side of the screen now. We'll talk a little bit about major giving, and that'll be our starting place as we move further into the conversation and start to talk about these segmentations. But we'll also spend time talking about mass solicitation. What we think about is sort of traditionally annual giving work, and a little bit about the VIP concierge approach to working with patients toward the middle of the presentation, of course, but they're also unique in the ways in which your staff work with these prospects. It tends to be more personal, sort of higher touch if you think about it. And you'll notice a couple of steps here. And on the left-hand side, that often starts with a wealth qualification of these prospects, right? Determination of capacity. And there are steps on the way to the right-hand side of the slide, and we think about the relationship qualification side. So very important on the identification of prospects for major giving. What's in between the left-hand side and the right-hand side, those 2 types of qualification, include a couple of steps in research, often being a really important part of working with these donors, or actually sort of preparing to work well with these donors. So a little bit of additional prospect research often makes sense here. So when you think about submitting files on a regular basis and using scores to get, again, from a a big group of prospects and down to a manageable group of prospects, those initial scores act more like a pre-screening for this particular group. And the opportunity to do a little bit more granular research and work with more granular information often makes a lot of sense here. Really, it sets gift officers up well, to do an even better job engaging with their prospects, and certainly gives them the confidence that they're working with prospects that are well suited for this type of outreach, and it helps them define what the cultivation process can be moving forward. This really represents a best practice. It has been a best practice. It continues to be a best practice, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about research here in just a minute and offer you some ideas that I would often talk to my consulting clients about. But before I move on, I'll pause and point out that you'll also notice a mention of physician champions on this particular slide here as well, and part of the major giving workflow. I particularly like to talk about major giving as part, or physician champions as part of major giving rather, because all of this is so very relationship driven, right? It's rooted in relationships. So very often individual staff people from the development office form relationships with specific physician champions, and they partner and collaborate quite closely. Physicians obviously have relationships with their patients, and then gift officers have relationships with prospects and donors, right? So it's part of the reason why I like to fold it in on the major giving side of things. But I think equally as important, maybe more important, is that major giving prospects are really thinking about making a genuine investment in your programs, right, in the way that you provide care. And who better to help your major gift prospects think about the importance of those types of investments than your clinicians and the people that are so very close to the type of care you provide and really truly understand the value of bringing advancement to that. And physicians often have a really important perspective on that. Paige will talk more about that in just a couple of minutes. So in the interest of time, we'll keep talking. I'll spend just a few minutes on that research piece and offer you some ideas there. So if we think about, sort of to revisit that idea about the initial wealth screening being like a pre-screen, goal to identify that right size group of prospects for your staff bandwidth, it's at this point, the next step really is to talk about that detailed wealth screen. And, different vendors approach this really differently. So I'm going to stick to the programmatic side of prospect research today, rather than talking about the ins and outs of what that more granular layer of insight could look like. I am a big believer in the importance of solid research practices to make sure that these activities are really time well spent for your staff. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that. And I'll say it really simply and really plainly, that research time is really only time well spent if it advances development activity, right? Research for the sake of research it's wasted resource, ultimately lost time and productivity. So a couple, again, practical things that I would talk to my consulting clients about to help make the research side of things a little more approachable and a little more dynamic for their offices, again, with that consistent opportunity to identify new potential prospects with this population being unique. The first of which is to set time limits when you engage in research. And by time limits, I mean between 5 and 15 minutes, right? Really kind of conservative, especially at the beginning of research practices and beginning of the relationship qualification side of working with your best prospects. That's really, really important. And I also think in and around budgeting time well with research activity, making sure that it complements the way in which the relationship with your prospect is moving forward, it's important to consider tiering those activities, right? So your researcher might spend, just, quick 5 or 10 minutes doing some initial sort of more granular wealth qualification before a gift officer starts to, put shoe leather to this, so to speak. And then after the initial qualification on the relationship side takes place, it might get a little more research time. And as the gift officer and the prospect advance the relationship, you might get a little more time as you're thinking about solicitation strategy, right? And the amount of solicitation, how that's shaping up. So I think it's really important to consider those two things in your research practice. Avoid rabbit holes, I guess is a really good way to say that too. And a lot of my clients, when we start to talk about how you budget your research time well, would say, well, Liza, 5 minutes or 15 minutes really isn't a lot of time, particularly if you have really robust wealth screening returns. So what do we do about that? And I think the most practical advice I can share with you all is to think about the information that comes back from granular research efforts and the information that is most helpful to your development team and advances relationships 85% of the time, right? Let's use our 85-15 rule here. And that should be your first stop when you start to really kind of roll your sleeves up with that data and think about how to use your time well right at the start. So information that's most helpful 85% of the time. And then along the way, you're likely going to identify some prospects that don't appear to be the best prospects for this type of engagement, right? Say, okay, and it's actually good news to do that early because you can then transition those prospects into the type of outreach and activity that's really well aligned with what their relationship is likely to, end up as a good solid starting place and what that journey is likely going to look like. Ultimately, all of these good research practices, can and should inform portfolio and pipeline management activities. So let's head that direction. And we're really starting to talk about and think about assigning prospects to gift officers. And, in the same way that good habits have been important for everything we've talked about so far and will be important for everything we're about to talk about, there are a few best practice conversations here. Again, I think this is a place where we're going to have some twists to talk about as far as the patient experience goes and how your gift officers work with these potential prospects. But we're really going to stay focused on right-sizing portfolios, talk about how to make sure those portfolios are balanced, and then the cadence with which you should be reviewing both of those particular things, right, as three sort of foundational aspects of pipeline and portfolio development that are going to serve everyone well on the other end of this particular conversation. So let's start with right-sized portfolios. And I think it's an important starting place here because the intent of grateful patient and grateful family work in the identification of prospects is not, of course, to bulk up portfolios, right, but to create a dynamic process to that process, right? So it's something that you really want to keep your finger on as you start to sort of re-engage with this type of work and think about the future of your program and what it can look like. Portfolio sizes are going to vary across the staff in your office. Principal gift officers, if you have those, as you would expect, they have the smallest portfolios. On the other side of the spectrum, your mid-level officers, if you have those, are going to have the biggest portfolios. And your major giving officers are going to be somewhere in the middle there. But I think it's important to establish guidelines for when it's appropriate to, let's call it, promote a prospect into portfolio, right, and assignment of a gift officer and agree on those as a staff. And it's equally as important to agree on the guidelines for when it's appropriate to transition prospects out of direct portfolio management and into another type of outreach. Along the way, the balance of the composition of portfolios is really important. And again, another thing that's important that everybody keep their finger on, particularly if you're thinking about, a lot of quantity as far as new potential prospects for gift officer engagement. And here it's the staging of your prospect development that's really key and really central. And so in the same way, there's no sort of one size fits all for what right-sized portfolio, right, is going to mean for all of you on the phone. There's no one size fits all for a balance in your portfolio. But very simply, it's good to, periodically, but on a regular schedule, take temperature on that balance and make sure that the staging and the percentage of prospects that are in each stage is really going to promote the type of pipeline and portfolio development that ultimately is going to lead to the type of outcomes that your team is expected to produce for the organization. And that's why the cadence is so very important. If reviewing both of those, types of things, the portfolio size and the balance, that's why it's so important to do that as a group. Of course, it's a great opportunity to regularly review how development work is happening and collaborate to advance, the relationships you have with your donors and your prospects. But it's also equally important to make sure you're practicing good donor management, pipeline management hygiene along the way. So, most importantly, pick a cadence and stick to it. So for some of you, it's going to be It's going to make a lot of sense to do this as often as weekly, right? If you have a really well-resourced approach to this. Others might do it monthly or quarterly, right? But go ahead and book it on the calendar and stick to it, right? Put some marks on the wall. But my encouragement right now, as you think about these three things, and under the broader umbrella of portfolio and pipeline management, and I don't think I'm going to tell you anything earth-shattering here, but I think sometimes those things are good to hear too. And that's about the importance of a good fundraising gut. I'm a data person, right? I believe in the power of data, and that data should be at the core of decision making. But I certainly appreciate and value the importance of that good fundraising gut and expertise, particularly when you're navigating circumstances that are as unprecedented as what we have, before us right now, and what we're all navigating, as an industry. So if it makes good sense to sort of pause and make temporary shifts in what your portfolio size or balance or your meeting cadence should be, right, to adapt and move and shift, so again you're meeting the types of outcomes that are most pressing for your organization at the moment, do it. Go ahead and make it, meet weekly instead of monthly or quarterly if you've got the need to do some things that are really tactical. Think about different portfolio balance. If your goals have moved and shifted quite a lot, if you're expected to raise a lot more money now than you were a couple of months ago, your portfolio balance might need to be a little different, or the size might be a little different than it was. But go ahead and make some shifts, revisit in 60 days, go from there. Final word of encouragement here is just to be sure that you're communicating thoroughly why you're changing things, what's changing, how you're changing them, particularly if you have other stakeholders that are part of your fundraising efforts. So physician champions, sort of being the notable type of stakeholder that comes to mind here, particularly if they're leveraging things like their own expertise or their reputations in support of your development efforts. It's important just to sort of keep the opportunity to provide everyone a really professional experience top of mind, right? And so it's also a good opportunity to over communicate what's changing and what you're monitoring along the way. And so I just mentioned physicians. So Paige, it might be a good opportunity to pause and give you a few minutes to talk more about that important type of relationship.
Sure. Thank you, Liza. One thing I'll do before I get into that is just impress upon the audience. I think that was great best practice information that Liza just covered. And one thing that sort of struck me is that every single thing that she described, whether it is research, segmentation, screening, balancing portfolios, even in the new normal, those can all take place. There's nothing preventing you. And I would say, a challenge right now is that if these are cadences or sort of rhythms that maybe have fallen off, that is absolutely understandable. I think everybody, we've talked to a lot of clients that have, pivoted, and you were collecting as part of the philanthropy office, you were coordinating PPE donations. So maybe you didn't have your regular donor portfolio review. And again, that's okay. What I would say is these best practices that we've described really benefit, as Liza said, from a cadence, a set schedule. And so if they've maybe fallen off a little bit from your normal rhythm, I would really encourage everyone to look at getting those back sort of started again, and using this really as a time to kind of, like Liza said, scrub everything with a little bit of a fine-tooth comb, make sure that you're aligned, with the right size and with where your system is headed. And I think that will be some time really well spent. So, on the topic of physician relations, what I actually put here on the slide today is a little bit of a shift to physician engagement, because I think we can recognize right now it might be difficult to sort of have the normal physician champion relationship that you're used to. I saw there's some great data that was just published recently about sort of the drop in elective procedures. And some of the ones that we know often spark grateful patient connections, such as cardiology, orthopedic procedures, they've had a pretty large drop in volume, again, because of the COVID crisis. And so now we're starting to see them kind of trickle in, but I think it's a fair assumption to say, physicians might not be working up to their normal patient volume. they're trying to get caught back up. I even saw some research yesterday from Definitive Healthcare where they were talking about, to meet the needs of patients, you may even see outflow into other facilities. So I think it's going to look a little bit different. So, my thought for physician engagement right now is really to listen, understand what their concerns are, how they're feeling about patients, and really what is their new normal. And I'll give you a great example. I recently was talking to someone who's has a friend who was having a knee surgery scheduled for June. It's now scheduled for December because the surgeon, instead of doing 5 procedures a day, is going to be limited to doing 3. And I imagine when you talk to that surgeon, just doing some listening about how he or she is feeling is really going to help you navigate that continued physician champion relationship. And then I think once you're able to do that listening, thinking about ways to respond. So, how you can help them, how they might prefer to engage with patients. And I feel like this is intuitive, but again, I think it's a good reminder. And I think what's going on right now is so amazing. It shows them that you care. I think this is being done wonderfully across health systems because I really do believe, that our clinicians, along with our philanthropy leaders, because you are absolutely part of this this bright shining moment for healthcare, they're the healthcare heroes. So, showing empathy, listening and responding in kind is really the way that you'll probably even deepen those physician relationships, maybe even more so than they were before the COVID crisis. So I think it's a great opportunity. There's just maybe a little time in which you might want to pivot, some of the conversations you have, at least initially. So just some food for thought there with respect to physicians. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Liza. We're going to continue down the path and really start talking about qualification and cultivation. So Liza, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, and we'll continue with the theme of relationships. And Paige, your point about working well with physicians maybe differently, I think a lot of that's applicable with your donor, your prospect population as well, right? When we start to think about the relationship qualification side of development work here, it's a place that's gonna, development work's gonna look really different. It has looked really different the past few weeks. It's probably gonna look really different moving forward, particularly if you've got a rounding program that's part of your Grateful Patient, Grateful Family work. That's probably been off the table for you for quite some time and maybe for the foreseeable future. But when we start to think about gift officer work, particularly the parts of gift officer work that rely on face-to-face and one-on-one contact, it's certainly a place where it's a great place for development work and your staff to really shine, right, and be creative in the ways in which they're working with your donors and prospects. And a couple ideas around this. And it's not going to surprise you that the first sort of stop on this part of the conversation is around the power of technology, right? So in the same ways that your patients have been receiving care virtually in unprecedented ways, it's highly likely that your staff has been engaged with donors and prospects virtually, and to a degree that's unprecedented as well. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time here with that in mind, except to encourage you to revisit what your definition of a donor visit is, right? When we think about gift officer metrics and, visit, very frequently, in person was part of how organizations thought about what a qualified donor visit was. But it's a really interesting time to think about the quality of virtual meetings, phone calls, and emails as really legitimate and pertinent ways to engage with your donors and your prospects in your community. Along a similar line, it's a good idea to revisit your team's definitions of your prospect, staging, especially if travel had been part of the way that your gift officers worked, as well, knowing, again, that's not really going to be part of the workflow for the foreseeable future. And it could have either extended or shortened the timeline for things like qualification and cultivation and solicitation. So some of you are probably finding that your timelines are a little shorter and tighter for that type of work, right? Back to the relevancy of healthcare in everybody's lives right now, identification of some meaning for people, sort of seeing healthcare, in ways that are sort of fresh and new. And certainly, you're very likely working to fund programs with sort of short timelines, right? And all of that stuff matters. Other factors, of course, as well. So it might be another place to consider some temporary shifts in the definitions of your prospect staging to, just allow a little bit of breathing room in there. And you might be seeing the opposite, that it's taking longer, right? So to Paige's earlier point, if you've really made some dramatic shifts in the types of things that have been part of your development program, PPE instead of, sort of more traditionally monetary giving, it's certainly an opportunity to think about sort of, again, putting some breathing room in what those prospect staging definitions are. It's also a good time to consider what the messaging is that's associated with your grateful patient, your grateful family efforts. Two things top of mind here, the first of which is in and around the message of honor a caregiver, because quite a lot of healthcare organizations and systems have spent a lot of time, and rightfully so, talking about their clinicians, right? Nurses and doctors, and I mean, dietary maintenance, everybody that's really been on the front lines of this pandemic and helping communities navigate through it from the clinical perspective. So if you haven't had an honor a caregiver part of your larger development program, this is a place where I'm going to say run, do not walk. And while it's certainly relevant on the patient and family side of things, I think it's relevant for, every piece and part of your fundraising program, because there's certainly many relationships throughout your community that can make people grateful for the type of care they receive, when they come through your doors or work with you remotely. I also personally think it's a really optimal time to think about sustainer type giving and digital engagement. And if you've really got the bandwidth to handle it, think about peer-to-peer giving and multi-channel outreach. It certainly offers the opportunity to grow, mature, and evolve your relationships with your donors and prospects. That goes hand in hand very often with revenue as well. And along the way, just document. That's it's sort of the capital THE best practice all the time. But a lot of you are engaging really uniquely with your donors and your prospects right now. People are giving to you with sort of new sort of meaning behind that, maybe new meaning, excuse me, behind what that relationship is. All of that information can facilitate good fundraising work, short-term and long-term. So make sure contact reports, actions, appeal codes, all that information is really, really solid and in ways that are, referenceable long-term. It doesn't take very long, a lot of distance between those interactions before the information is just lost forever. So it's a good time to recommit to the information going into your primary donor base as well. And it's actually, again, sort of another good transition point to talk a little bit about the annual giving side of things, the mass solicitation components that very often represent sort of the hardiest segmentation after a wealth screening. The indicators are probably a little different, might not be as wealth focused as when we're thinking about major giving and prospect research. We might be a little more inclined to think about philanthropic indicators and inclinations on that side of what it means to have a best prospect. And actually, before I keep moving, I'm going to do a quick side note here that a lot of you probably have a lot of first-time donors, patients, families, otherwise, in and around your annual giving efforts. And simultaneously, there seems to have been this really sort of big shift to digital and online engagement for healthcare, which it sort of has this reputation for having been rooted in a lot of direct mail activity, sort of historically and traditionally. So lots of new opportunities for engagement online. So make the most of the advancements that your team has made in that kind of space. It's certainly really applicable on the grateful patient side of things. So, email in particular makes a lot of sense here. It's cost effective, right? Again, something everybody loves, but there are a lot of other advantages to interacting with your potential patient or potential prospects, rather, who are patients in this way. First of which is that you can see who's interacting with those messages. Very often, not only can you see who's opening those messages, you can see what kinds of information they click on. Again, all usable information long-term as you think about how you continue to engage with these prospects. It also offers speed and flexibility and personalization, which can be, really extremely important right now, right? In such a dynamic environment, the opportunity to impact what your messages are in a way that's really nimble offers quite a lot of value to you and quite a lot of value to the people that are on the receiving end of those messages, and certainly a place where email has a leg up on direct mail. I think the biggest thing to consider here with email actually is sort of the protection of your primary donor database and your primary CRM. I think it's important to note that primary CRM is the warehouse for your legitimate prospects and donors, right? It's a place that we want to sort of limit volume of prospects that don't have a really established relationship with you yet. So certainly an opportunity for an email system to help manage that, right, and keep lots of potential prospects sort of nice and organized and help facilitate outreach while we protect that primary donor database as well. And as we think about the mix of direct mail, email, and other online that makes sense, there are going to be a lot of factors that influence that decision and what that mix looks like for all of you, on the other end of the call today. So, I'll say here simply, I think it's important to consider, this multi-channel approach, right? Both direct mail and online opportunities, but to make sure that the messages in those are, sort of playing nicely with each other and support the messages going through other giving vehicles. Two reasons for that. The first of which is that we know recency of care creates relevancy in messages, right? And there's actually a fairly narrow window of time between a care interaction and receiving information and solicitation when that's most successful and most impactful. So keep that in mind too as you start to think about the timeliness of your messages. And the second reason, as you continue to reach out to your donors and your prospects, sensitivity has been really at the core of a lot of those interactions the past couple of months, and it should be, part of a thoughtful approach to building mass solicitations and really any engagement with your donors, because life is changing, right, for everybody pretty quickly in ways that are unexpected, and so it's something to think about as well in and around cultivation, solicitation, and stewardship. So that's all going to look probably a little different for the foreseeable future than it did at the beginning of the year. I think it's a great opportunity to focus on the power of healthcare in your communities, but also to talk really, powerfully about the ways in which philanthropy have been important to healthcare and the ways in which donor engagement has been, really central to your organization and your clinicians and the people who have relied on the care that they provide the past couple of months. Healthcare is critical, during a crisis, but it certainly is essential each and every day, right? Crisis or not. So I think it's a great opportunity to help people understand the importance and power of philanthropy as part of healthcare. And a great opportunity to think about the ways in which you can personalize your outreach. And, there are endless ways in which you can do this. It's, everything as simple as a salutation, to who signs a letter, right? Is it, a clinician? Is it a peer? Is it a patient? Are you telling a patient's story? Again, endless ways you could think about this, but again, important to keep in mind that it's not a once and done, right? The continual sort of evolution and maturation of what those messages look like, and the ability to leverage detail and insight about how they've interacted with your organization before is, the most powerful tool in which you'll have to understand what motivates your prospects to give. And so when we think about mass solicitation being the most sizable segment, and often the most sizable way in which we interact with potential donors, we'll sort of shift gears here and talk a little bit about what's often the smallest segment, and that's the VIP concierge aspect of grateful patient programs. And it's not among the most common components of a program that we see, so it's unlikely that everybody on the other end of the call has something like this as part of the way in which they work with patient prospects and donors. But I think it's certainly worth spending a few minutes here because it's, when it's in place, it's a really important way that the development team stewards the significant investors, right, to your program. These programs, they can be really straightforward. They can be really complex. So I'll pause here. If you're not familiar with VIP Concierge inpatient fundraising, I'll note two things about it. The first of which is that it's a different conversation than concierge medicine. And the second of which is that VIP and concierge in the fundraising space isn't intended to sort of, impact care experiences directly, right? It's not moving people sort of to the front of the line is the way I think about it, but rather it's about the types of experiences sort of on the softer side when people are engaged with you as patients. So, thinking about relationship and the creation of awareness, right, of philanthropy as part of your healthcare system. So again, it can be as simple as, a check-in visit from a patient liaison or a CEO, validated parking or meal vouchers for visitors, along the way. It's those kind of experience-based things that we see most often as part of VIP and concierge programmatic elements and grateful patient, grateful family. It's another part of patient fundraising that's likely experienced a lot of shifts lately and will probably need some reimagining moving forward because that's often, again, it relies on a lot of direct interaction in and around care experiences, and it hasn't been available and will likely look a little bit different moving forward. So certainly a place I think is going to be really thoughtful with Grateful Patient. As we, as Paige said, think about what the 3.0 looks like with this type of fundraising. And I've got two more thoughts, and then I'm going to turn the conversation over to Paige to wrap up. It's good to talk for just a minute about predictive modeling. We've talked about wealth screening, and there's a lot to like about wealth screening. It's fast and it's efficient, and it can help provide some good directional indicators, really quickly. But it also makes sense to pause and talk a little bit about predictive modeling, which is the opportunity to leverage custom data that really speaks to your specific organization's best prospects for specific types of gifts. And very often this conversation happens closest to your existing base of donors and prospects, right? So think about that fundraising database and the identification of potential within that existing base of support. Which is actually a really interesting idea if you've had the benefit of a lot of new or increased giving as the result, response to, crisis in your community, and lots of new people have gotten engaged in your organization. So it might be very applicable on that side of things as well. But even people that have experience leveraging these tools in their programs may not be aware that you can, follow a very similar process on your patient population as well, to identify the people within your patient population who are most likely to convert to being donors specifically to your organization. So let's talk a little bit about that, how that happens, and we'll do this pretty quickly in the interest of time. Modeling, it's a technical word, but very basically it means that we take relationship indicators, right? We want data that helps us understand who these people are to you and who you are to them. So in the case of considering best potential patient prospects, it's HIPAA compliant information in and around very often things like broad area of care and physician, recency, frequency of visit. Again, it's a place where there's, just a huge potential with what we could consider as part of assembling this type of data, but it's a data-driven sort of relationship profile. But we also want to be able to go to the public space and look for really robust indicators to help us sort of look beyond what you know about your prospects and consider information that you probably don't know about your patients. So, it's robust and, it's wealth indicators, of course, but, broad philanthropic patterns matter here, broad consumer behaviors. And then very basically, it's the opportunity to sort of statistically comb all of that data in your patient population to look for patterns and commonalities that would point to your organization's best potential prospects to become donors. And then to essentially grade everybody on a curve, right? If you think about the larger population, you can identify from a data perspective sort of the quote unquote ideal patient converter. You can grade everybody in a curve and tell you how close or how far away everybody is to being that ideal patient converter. So I think it's good to sort of pause when you think about what the future of your program is and the type of information and data that's most informative and the types of outcomes that you're hoping to achieve. Wealth screening, I think it's a really powerful tool, but it may not get you all the way there, right, with some new growth goals and the evolution of your program. So just good to sort of pause and talk a little bit about the full potential of leveraging data. Final sort of note from me before Paige wraps up for us is, that patient fundraising, it's an investment of resources and an investment of staff time. But once the strategy is working, and it's done really well, there are benefits for your patients, of course. We know expressions of gratitude are important in their healing and their care experiences. It's important for your clinicians and your caregivers and your staff, right? We know expressions of gratitude are important to them as well. And of course, it's important on the revenue side and the bottom line, because that's how we all continue to provide the very best care to our communities. And we've got, the most relevant demonstration of the importance of that very recently. So I hope what rose to the top the past few minutes as I've talked today are two things. The first of which is that segmenting your patient population and the ability to leverage data is sort of the key as you think about the future of your program and how you're going to resource that and how you're going to engage with your patients. And that the reliance on best practices, things that have been sort of core, central, and foundational in fundraising continue to be relevant today. And that very often it's just sort of a twist or a tweak along the way, or the application of a good fundraising gut that is going to help you make adjustments short term, so you can also make some good adjustments long term, and think about what the next iteration of patient fundraising looks like at your organization. So with that, Paige, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you, Liza. So I think that begs the question. We've talked a lot, everything from major gifts to annual gift solicitation, to leveraging direct mail, as well as digital for multi-channel. And at the end of the day, you might have the question, so, okay, there are lots of things that I can do. What's the best next step? What can I do right now? I think what we would leave you with is really centering on relationships. No one does relationships better than the philanthropic office. And so think about the relationships that are important right now. We mentioned engaging with physicians. There are certainly going to be other people, service line directors, administrators. Again, if you didn't have those relationships before, now is a great time to start them. And if they existed, and I likely suspect that they did, it's a great time to strengthen them. I would also think about revising and strengthening the case for support. And this may go across the organization, but since we're talking about grateful patient programs, what I would say here is think about what you're asking for from your patients. How do their donations connect with your mission now and in the future? Make sure data is accurate. Again, you've likely had some changes in your work rhythm, so now is a great time to get the house in order through either data hygiene, particularly if you're going to do some digital communications. Scrubbing and cleaning email addresses is great, and as we all know, patient data is messy. So if you're going to kind of restart your Grateful Patient program, or if you want to kind of look at how to move forward, moving forward with good data is always going to be really important. Be innovative. Think about virtual tours. Think about things that you wanted to do and didn't really have a compelling reason to do it, and try new stuff. I believe if you do it with empathy, not every new idea is going to work, but you'll get good feedback, and it's worth giving it a shot. And then last but not least, we always suggest benchmarking your data. Call your peers, engage with AHP's benchmarking service, learn how you can improve in certain areas, and find out who's doing it really well and connect with them. I am so enamored of the relationships that we built with the team at AHP, those of you that are members that serve on the boards, and I just can't think of a better group to network with in terms of understanding how you can engage with leaders in the space to tweak and make your program stronger. And in terms of, what we see with really great focus on grateful patients, here's an example from the Anova Foundation. Obviously, this is pre-COVID. We'll be interested to see how data changes after, but if you're not familiar with Anova, they're a 5-hospital system in Northern Virginia. And by really turning on a focus for grateful patients supported by technology, they were able to see a 40% increase in volume of grateful patient gifts raised by gift officers, increased average gift sizes, as well as increased fundraising from grateful patient via direct mail. And so the reason we pulled this example up now, even though that we're talking about, how you patient fundraise in the new normal, you might say, well, why do I have an example of the before? Is that what I think this does is it shows how grateful patient fundraising really sort of impacts all across the spectrum in terms of the types and size of gifts that you get and what it can do to strengthen the bottom line. And if we go back to the pains and the challenges that we know that you're facing right now, revenue is really top of mind. And, not only for the healthcare philanthropic arm, but for the system writ large. And if we don't leave you with anything else, what I would say today is, don't be afraid or don't be shy about the value you bring to your system. Whether it's through grateful patient fundraising or other initiatives, you are an incredibly important source of revenue in a very uncertain time. And so we hope that we've been able to give you some great information about how to move forward with grateful patient fundraising and maybe fundraising in general, because I really do believe our philanthropic, partners across this sector are healthcare heroes. And I just want to end before we move to Q&A by saying thank you to all of you for what you do. And thank you for AHP for hosting a really great virtual event. So we'll turn now and open it up for questions. Thank you all for joining us.